Eliza did not cry when her father told her to pack her things, not because she was strong, but because humiliation had burned every tear out of her long before that morning, leaving only a hollow ache behind her ribs as she stood in the bright kitchen doorway, while he avoided her eyes and spoke instead to the rancher waiting outside, like the matter had nothing to do with blood or love. The sun poured through the window, catching on the faded hem of her dress, the one her stepmother called serviceable, and highlighting the features people never let her forget: her broad shoulders from years of labor, the crooked tooth she hid when she smiled, the plainness that made neighbors look past her as if she were furniture. "She's not delicate," her father said, voice tight, explaining her away like damaged goods. "But she works hard and won't cause trouble." And when Eliza realized he wasn't selling land or livestock but her, something inside her went very still. The rancher, Caleb Harlan, stood with his hat in his hands, tall and quiet, his boots dusty from miles of road, his eyes weathered in a way that suggested grief more than cruelty. Yet he said nothing to stop the exchange as her father accepted a pouch of coins with shaking fingers, relief written plain across his face. Eliza stared at the floorboards, listening to the soft clink of money that replaced her place in the family, remembering every whispered insult, every laugh behind her back, every time she had overheard someone say no man would ever choose her. And now here she was, not chosen at all, simply removed. She expected orders, harsh words, maybe even force, but Caleb only cleared his throat and said gently that she could bring a shawl if she needed it, the softness in his voice almost unbearable because it came too late to matter. When she stepped onto the porch, the town seemed suddenly too bright, too open, the weight of eyes pressing into her spine as if everyone already knew she was unwanted. And when she climbed into the wagon beside a man she barely knew, she did not look back at the house where she had never truly belonged. The wheels creaked as they rolled away, the sound marking the end of her childhood more clearly than any goodbye. And as Caleb guided the horses forward without looking at her, Eliza realized something terrifying and strange at once. She had been given away, not stolen, and that kind of rejection cut deeper than fear. Yet as the road stretched out ahead, and the familiar town shrank behind her, a quiet thought surfaced beneath the shame, fragile but undeniable. She had finally left everyone who had ever told her she was worth nothing at all. The wagon moved steadily across the open plain, sunlight stretching wide and unforgiving over the dirt road as Eliza sat stiffly on the wooden bench, hands folded in her lap as if holding herself together by force alone, every mile putting more distance between her and the only life she had known, even if that life had never truly wanted her. Caleb drove without hurry, reins loose in his hands, giving the horses an easy pace that matched the quiet he carried. And though he sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm when the wagon jolted, he never invaded her space, never looked at her in a way that made her shrink. The silence between them was heavy, but not sharp. And that unsettled her more than cruelty would have, because she had learned how to endure harshness but not restraint. Dust rose in soft clouds behind the wheels, the wind tugging at the edge of her shawl. And with each passing fence post, Eliza replayed the morning again. The sound of coins, her father's turned back, the way no one had said her name like it mattered. She wondered what kind of man took a woman that way, through transaction instead of courtship, and whether she would be expected to earn her place through obedience, through labor, through quiet endurance, the same way she always had. Caleb finally spoke when the road dipped toward a shallow creek, his voice low and careful, telling her they would stop for water, and that she didn't need to answer him if she didn't wish to. A statement that surprised her enough to lift her gaze. No one had ever given her permission not to perform before. When they halted, He jumped down first, offering a hand out of habit before quickly pulling it back, apologizing softly as if he'd overstepped, and she climbed down on her own, boots sinking into damp earth near the water's edge. She knelt to splash her face, the coolness cutting through the tightness in her chest, and when she straightened, she found Caleb a few paces away, focused on the horses, deliberately turned so she could have the moment to herself. That simple courtesy lodged painfully in her throat. As they ate in silence, hard bread, dried meat, Eliza noticed how he tore his portion in half and left it beside her without comment, pretending not to see whether she took it. And she did, hunger winning over pride. When they set off again, the land grew emptier, rolling hills replacing farms and fences, and the realization settled in that there would be no turning back, no familiar road to retreat along. She studied Caleb then, the lines etched into his face by sun and years, the stillness of a man who had learned not to waste words, and she wondered if he had chosen her because she was cheap, because she was strong, or because she would not ask for things he could not give. As the afternoon wore on, fear crept in quietly, but beneath it something else stirred too, an uneasy awareness that for the first time in her life, she was traveling toward the unknown without being mocked for it, and that possibility frightened her almost as much as it tempted her. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a wide meadow, sunlight spilling across its rough-hewn logs and the tall grass around it swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. And when Caleb brought the wagon to a halt, Eliza felt a cautious breath loosen in her chest despite herself, because the place looked quiet, ordinary, almost peaceful in a way she had never been allowed to expect. He climbed down first, and makeshift steps creaked under his boots as he moved efficiently, unloading her small bundle and setting it carefully by the door as though it mattered, as though she mattered, then stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin without a word, giving her the choice to enter first. Eliza hesitated, scanning the open land instinctively for witnesses, for eyes that might judge or whisper, but there was nothing, just sky, grass, and the low hum of insects. So she stepped forward and crossed the threshold on her own. Inside, the cabin was simple and clean, a single room washed in warm light from the open window, with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a neatly made bed, and a kettle hanging near the hearth, and the absence of clutter felt deliberate, as if Caleb had shaped his life to leave room rather than fill it. He set to work quietly, fetching water from the barrel and setting bread on the table, moving around her without crowding, and the restraint in his movements unsettled Eliza because it forced her to confront a thought she had never dared hold before, that maybe pain was not inevitable. When she reached out to touch the table, grounding herself in the solidness of it, her sleeve slipped back, exposing a jagged scar along her forearm, pale against her skin, and she froze, waiting for the familiar look of disgust or mockery. Caleb noticed, his eyes flicking to the mark before quickly returning to the kettle, his jaw tightening, not with revulsion but something closer to anger. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, saying only that she could rest if she wished, and that there was no rush to anything. The words left her disoriented, because rest had always been something she earned, not something offered. She sat slowly, hands clasped tight in her lap, and as the silence stretched, she found herself studying the details she had never been allowed to enjoy. The way light caught dust motes in the air, the smell of warm wood, the faint sound of wind moving through grass outside, and it felt like standing inside a fragile bubble that might burst if she moved wrong. When Caleb placed a cup of water in front of her, their fingers brushed by accident, and she flinched automatically, heat flooding her face with shame, but he immediately stepped back, murmuring a soft apology as if he had startled a skittish animal, and the gentleness of that response hit her harder than cruelty ever had. She took a careful sip, the water cool and grounding, and for the first time since the auction her shoulders eased a fraction. Yet even as the cabin wrapped her in its quiet promise of safety, a doubt took root, because Eliza knew from bitter experience that calm often came before a storm, and as she sat there in the golden afternoon light, she could not shake the fear that this peace was temporary, borrowed, and waiting to be claimed back by the world the moment she allowed herself to believe in it. The illusion of safety fractured quietly rather than shattering, slipping in through the open window with the warm afternoon air as Eliza stood near the wash basin, scrubbing dust from her hands, while Caleb repaired a loose hinge on the cabin door, the soft scrape of metal against wood marking time between them. She thought she could keep her head down long enough for the unease to pass, but when she reached to roll her sleeve back into place, the fabric caught, revealing the lattice of old scars along her wrist and forearm, thin, pale lines crossing one another like a map drawn by pain rather than ink. And this time she didn't pull away fast enough. Caleb froze mid-motion, not staring but seeing, his shoulders stiffening as if the weight of the marks had settled on him too, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Eliza's chest tightened as memories pressed in, her father's voice telling her she brought trouble on herself, the way neighbors had looked away when she stumbled home. Bruised, the whispered judgments that taught her early that explaining only made things worse. She braced herself for questions, for disbelief, for the subtle withdrawal she had come to expect once people realized she was not merely unwanted but damaged. Instead, Caleb set the tool down carefully and stepped back, giving her space, his voice low and deliberate as he said he wouldn't ask her to explain what she didn't want to share. The restraint in that choice loosened something inside her, and before she could stop herself, words began to spill out in uneven fragments. How the scars weren't from one man or one night, but from years of being passed between households that needed labor more than kindness. How silence had become her shield, because every attempt to defend herself had been twisted into proof that she was the problem. She didn't cry as she spoke. She had learned to keep her voice steady, but her hands trembled, betraying the effort it took to remain upright under the truth. Caleb listened without interrupting, his jaw set, eyes darkening, not with judgment, but with a restrained fury that startled her. And when she finally fell quiet, he nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than weighing a verdict. He told her then, quietly, that he had rejected other brides not because they were flawed, but because they expected him to be someone he was not, and that when he saw her at the auction, he recognized a look he knew too well, the look of someone who had learned to survive by disappearing. The admission stunned her. No one had ever compared their wounds to hers before. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Eliza felt exposed, yet strangely lighter, as though naming the truth had stolen some of its power. Still, doubt lingered, because knowing someone saw her scars did not mean they would choose her despite them, and as she wrapped her sleeve back into place, she wondered whether this honesty would be the moment that finally sent her back into the world she had tried so desperately to leave behind. The knock came hard against the cabin door, not loud enough to be a threat, but sharp enough to slice clean through the fragile calm Eliza had been clinging to. And both she and Caleb stilled at once as the sound echoed across the clearing outside, birds lifting suddenly from the trees, as if they sensed what followed men like this. Caleb moved first, placing the hinge tool down slowly and stepping in front of her without touching her, his body a quiet barrier as he reached for the door and opened it just enough to face the man standing there with dust-caked boots, a badge pinned crooked on his vest, and a rolled document clenched tight in his fist. The deputy didn't bother with courtesy, his eyes sliding past Caleb and landing on Eliza with unsettling familiarity, a thin smile creeping across his face as he announced that he'd been riding through on official business and had questions about a woman recently auctioned in town. A woman whose name he spoke with deliberate emphasis, as if savoring how her shoulders tensed at the sound. Eliza felt the room tilt, memories flooding back of authority figures who wore badges or papers and used them not to protect but to justify cruelty. And her fingers curled into the hem of her dress as the deputy unrolled the document to reveal a transfer notice stamped by the same auctioneer who had sold her like cattle. He claimed there had been irregularities, debts unpaid, ownership contested, and that until matters were settled, she was required to return to town for clarification. His gaze never leaving her face, as if daring her to object. Caleb's voice remained even as he replied that the sale had been lawful, witnessed, and completed, but the deputy only shrugged, tapping the paper with his finger and remarking that papers had a way of changing once men with influence got involved. Eliza's chest tightened with shame and fury because she recognized this tactic too well, the slow erosion of safety through technicalities designed to remind her she had never truly been free. When she tried to speak, the words snagged in her throat, but she forced herself to step forward, her voice quiet but steady, as she said she would not go back, that the auction had ended her obligations. The deputy laughed softly, eyes flicking to her wrists as if he knew exactly where to look, and suggested she shouldn't make trouble for the rancher sheltering her, hinting that harboring disputed property could invite consequences. That was when Caleb's restraint finally shifted. Not into violence, but into something colder as he took the document, tore it clean down the middle, and let the pieces fall between them like dead leaves. The deputy's smile vanished, replaced by anger, but Caleb met it without flinching and told him plainly that Eliza was not property, disputed or otherwise, and that if anyone wanted to challenge that, they could do so openly and with witnesses. The deputy backed away slowly, issuing a thin warning before turning toward his horse. But as the sound of hooves faded, Eliza understood the truth with aching clarity. The past had found her, and it would not retreat so easily this time. Caleb didn't wait for the sound of the deputy's horse to fully disappear before he closed the door and set his back against it, not in fear, but in a deliberate pause that told Eliza he was weighing the next choice carefully, and when he finally turned toward her, she saw something in his eyes that unsettled her more than the threat outside. Concern, not anger, not ownership, but the quiet question of whether she felt safe here after all. He moved to the hearth and added another log to the fire, the small flames licking upward as if trying to push back the chill that had crept into the room, then poured water into a tin cup and held it out to her without a word, not forcing it into her hands, simply offering. Eliza hesitated, her instincts screaming that kindness always came with a cost, that every soft gesture she'd ever accepted had eventually been used against her. But her hands were shaking badly now, and she took the cup, the warmth grounding her enough to breathe again. Caleb sat on the low bench across from her, leaving space between them, and began mending a torn strap from his saddle, as if this moment were ordinary, as if she hadn't just been threatened with being dragged back into a life she thought she'd escaped, and that normalcy cracked something open inside her. She blurted out that the deputy would return, that men like him always did, and that Caleb shouldn't ruin himself for her sake, her voice sharp with fear, and the kind of self-loathing that told her she wasn't worth the trouble. Caleb didn't interrupt, didn't reassure her with promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he told her quietly that he'd grown up watching men in town decide who deserved protection and who didn't, and that he'd learned early how dangerous it was when people stopped seeing others as human. He said he'd rejected her at the auction, not because she was large or plain or scarred, but because he was afraid. Afraid of the responsibility, afraid of inviting the town's scrutiny, afraid of failing someone who had already been failed too many times. Eliza's breath caught at the honesty, because it didn't excuse him, but it explained him, and explanation was a rare mercy in her life. Caleb reached into a drawer and pulled out a loaf of bread and a small crock of stew, setting them on the table between them like a peace offering, and when she tried to refuse, he gently insisted, saying that no one could make good decisions while starving. As she ate, the warmth spread through her body and something else followed it. Shame at how quickly she clung to this fragile safety, and terror at how much she already feared losing it. When she finally looked up, Caleb was watching her not with pity but with resolve. And he said that if the past came back again, they would face it together. Not as rescuer and burden, but as two people choosing not to surrender ground they'd already claimed. For the first time since the auction, Eliza felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest, something gentler than hope, but stronger than fear. The sense that mercy, when freely given, could be more frightening and more powerful than cruelty ever was. The bridge lay just beyond the tree line. A narrow span of weathered planks stretched across a shallow but fast-moving creek, and Eliza felt her pulse quicken the moment she saw it, because crossings had always marked turning points in her life, places where there was no standing still, only forward or back. Caleb led the horse slowly, reins loose in his hand, while Eliza walked beside him, the morning light breaking through the branches and scattering across the water in flashing fragments that made the world feel unstable, as if one wrong step could send everything spilling apart. Halfway onto the bridge, the sound of hooves cut sharply through the quiet, and Eliza froze as three riders emerged from the trees behind them, the same deputy at their front, his badge glinting like a challenge. He called out that Caleb was making a mistake, that there were easier ways to handle a situation like this, and that the town was already whispering about the rancher who thought he could decide law for himself. Eliza's instinct was to step back, to release Caleb from the burden she'd become. But before she could move, he handed her the reins and stepped forward alone, boots planted firm on the bridge planks, as if anchoring himself there. The deputy dismounted and advanced a few steps, spreading his hands in false conciliation while suggesting that Caleb hand Eliza over temporarily, just until things were sorted, promising no harm would come to her if she cooperated. The words scraped against Eliza's nerves because she'd heard them before, always spoken by men who wanted obedience dressed up as mercy. Caleb listened without interrupting, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Not a contract, but a land deed bearing his name and the county seal, proof that this land, this bridge, this crossing fell under his authority. He held it up calmly and said that the deputy was trespassing, that Eliza was his guest, and that any further attempt to remove her would be treated as an act of aggression. One of the riders laughed nervously, but the sound died quickly when Caleb didn't blink or raise his voice, when he simply stood there, wide and immovable, blocking the only path forward. The deputy's face hardened as he realized intimidation had failed, and he muttered that Caleb was choosing isolation, that no one would stand with him when the town turned. Eliza felt something shift then, not fear, but clarity, and she stepped up beside Caleb, placing a steady hand on his arm where everyone could see it, her presence transforming his defiance into a shared stance. The creek rushed beneath them, loud and relentless, and for a long, charged moment no one moved. Finally, the deputy spat into the dirt, signaling his men to remount, warning that this wasn't finished. As they rode away, Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and Caleb turned to her, meeting her eyes with quiet certainty. They crossed the rest of the bridge together, leaving the threat behind them for now, and Eliza understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to stand where you were, even when the world tried to push you back. The gathering took place at midday in the open meadow beyond the cottonwoods, where the grass bent softly under the wind and the sky stretched wide and unhidden, leaving no room for secrets, and Eliza felt the weight of every step as she and Caleb approached the circle already forming there. Ranch hands stood on one side, townsfolk on the other, faces tight with curiosity and judgment, while at the center an elder from the nearby settlement waited beside a low table where objects had been laid out deliberately. A folded ledger, a length of rope, and a small carved token used in community reckonings. The deputy was already present, speaking in low, urgent tones to anyone who would listen, framing the story before Eliza could, painting her as a disruption, a problem that needed resolving before it spread. When Caleb stepped forward, the murmuring quieted, not because he demanded silence, but because his presence carried a gravity people had learned to respect, and he asked simply that the truth be heard in full daylight, where no one could twist it later. The elder nodded and motioned for the circle to close, creating a boundary that made Eliza's chest tighten because circles had always meant judgment to her, never protection. The deputy spoke first, accusing Caleb of sheltering a woman under false pretenses, hinting at rumors about her past, and suggesting that the town had a right to decide where she belonged. When he finished, the elder turned to Eliza, not with suspicion, but with a steady patience that startled her, and invited her to speak if she wished. For a moment, her old instincts flared, to lower her head, to let others define her. But then she remembered the bridge, remembered Caleb standing firm without shouting, and she stepped forward into the center of the circle. She didn't offer excuses or apologies. Instead, she told them exactly who she was, where she had come from, and how easily people had decided she was something to be passed along or pushed aside. As she spoke, she reached into her pocket and placed a small, worn keepsake on the table. A simple ribbon her mother had once braided for her hair, proof of a life before the rumors. And the elder examined it with care before nodding. Caleb then added his voice, brief and controlled, stating that Eliza was under his protection by choice, not obligation, and that no rope or ledger could outweigh that decision. The elder lifted the carved token and asked a single question meant for everyone present, whether they would judge based on fear or fact. One by one, the murmurs shifted, uncertainty creeping in where certainty had lived. Finally, the elder placed the token between Eliza and Caleb, declaring that no claim against her held standing, and that any further pursuit would be seen as harassment, not justice. The deputy stiffened, but said nothing, knowing the circle had turned against him. As it dissolved, Eliza felt something she hadn't expected. Belonging, fragile but real, and she realized that sometimes truth didn't need defending with force. It only needed the courage to be spoken where everyone could hear it. The decision of the circle did not bring peace as quickly as Eliza had hoped. Instead, it drew a sharp, brittle quiet over the meadow as the deputy realized the authority he relied on had slipped from his grasp, and his reaction was not acceptance, but humiliation. A dangerous thing in a man used to being obeyed. He stepped forward abruptly, his boots grinding into the grass as he accused the elder of favoritism, of being swayed by sentiment, his voice rising as he pointed at Eliza, and declared that women like her always brought disorder wherever they went. The insult cut deep, but before Eliza could respond, Caleb moved, not in anger but in finality, placing himself between them with one hand raised, palm outward, a clear boundary drawn in daylight. The elder's gaze hardened, and he signaled for 2 town constables to step closer, not to seize Eliza, but to restrain the deputy if necessary, a reversal that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably as power changed hands. Eliza felt her knees weaken, not from fear of being taken, but from the realization that this moment would decide whether the town learned mercy or doubled down on cruelty. The deputy, red-faced and shaking, reached toward his belt as if to remind everyone of his badge, but the elder spoke sharply, declaring that the matter was settled, and that any further disturbance would result in removal from office pending review. Silence followed, thick and heavy, broken only by the wind moving through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Eliza stepped forward then, surprising even herself, and addressed the deputy directly, her voice steady as she said she did not want revenge, did not want to see him ruined the way she had been treated, but wanted only to live without being hunted by rumors and threats. Her words robbed him of the confrontation he seemed to crave. There was no enemy to fight, no crime to punish, only restraint offered where punishment might have been easier. The elder seized that opening, announcing that the deputy would be escorted out of the meadow and barred from further involvement in the matter, not jailed, not publicly shamed, but stripped of the leverage he had abused. Some in the crowd murmured that it was too lenient, others that it was just, but the decision stood. As the deputy was led away, his shoulders slumped not from defeat by force, but from the weight of consequences he could not argue away. Eliza watched him go, her chest tight with conflicting emotions, and realized that mercy did not always feel like relief. Sometimes it felt like standing in the open after a storm, unsure what shape the land would take next. Caleb turned to her then, asking quietly if she was all right, and she nodded, knowing that justice had been served not through punishment, but through the refusal to become what had harmed her. The meadow slowly emptied as people drifted away, conversations hushed and thoughtful, leaving behind only the sound of wind passing through tall grass and the steady blue of the open sky. And Eliza stood there feeling the strange weightlessness that followed survival, the kind that came not from escape, but from standing her ground and being believed. Caleb remained beside her, not rushing her toward the horse, not assuming the next step, simply waiting as if the choice of where she went now belonged entirely to her. And that quiet respect settled deeper in her chest than any promise could have. She watched the elder walk away, the carved token still resting on the table, proof that her life had finally been discussed in daylight rather than decided in shadows. And she realized how rare that was for someone like her. Caleb asked softly if she wanted to return to town to collect her things, or if she would rather go back to the ranch and rest, and the way he phrased it, offering paths instead of commands, made her throat tighten. She looked toward the road that led back to the place where she'd been mocked, weighed, and whispered about, and then toward the distant line of hills where Caleb's land stretched open and unfinished, full of work and uncertainty, but also space to breathe. Eliza reached into her pocket and pulled out the ribbon her mother had once braided, the same one she had laid on the table in the circle, and tied it carefully around her wrist, not as a reminder of where she came from, but as proof that she could carry her past without being owned by it. She turned to Caleb then, and told him she did not want to be hidden away or protected like something fragile. But she also did not want to keep running from people who would never be satisfied. She wanted to stay where she could build something honest, even if it was hard. Caleb listened, nodded once, and said that if she stayed, it would be as his partner in the work and the choices ahead, not as a bride purchased or a problem managed. The word partner settled between them like a bridge finally completed, and Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar relief of being asked instead of claimed. They walked back toward the horse together, side by side, and as Caleb helped her into the saddle, he did it without ceremony, without ownership, the same way one would help someone who was staying because they wanted to, not because they had nowhere else to go. The ranch came into view as the sun climbed higher, barns catching the light, land waiting to be shaped by effort rather than fear, and Eliza felt something steady take root inside her, something she had never been allowed before. She was not the woman the town had judged, not the burden others had tried to pass along. She was someone choosing her own place in the world. And if you were in her place, having been rejected, judged, and finally seen, Would you walk back into the life that broke you, or choose the home that let you stand in the open and decide for yourself? If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,